Scholastic Audio presents Infinity Ring, Book 5, Cave of Wonders, by Matthew J. Kirby. Read by Dion Graham. Have you seen in all the length and breadth of the earth a city such as Baghdad? Umara ibn Aqil, 9th century poet. Chapter 1. Caravans and Camels. The desert wind whipped around them, stirring up sand. Dak shielded his eyes and used his shirt to cover his mouth to keep from breathing in the grit. Sera and Rick did the same. They were standing in the middle of a dusty road, the three of them having just warped from the Great Wall in Ming Dynasty China. For Dak, the prickling, sickening disorientation of having his body squeezed through time and space like a basketball through a keyhole hadn't faded yet, and neither had his excitement. "Where are we?" he asked. This was their 12th warp together. You'd think by now Dak would be used to it, but that question still thrilled him. Where are we? What would they see and do? Who would they meet? So far, Christopher Columbus, Vikings, King Louis with his wonderful gooey cheese, Harriet Tubman, the ancient Maya? People and cultures Dak had only read about in books before now. Sera checked the infinity ring before tucking it away in her satchel. "Coordinates are right. We should be near the city of Baghdad on January 27th, the year 1258. "Good." Dak reached to pull out the square. "Let's figure out the break we're supposed to fix here." "Hold on," Rick coughed. "Let's get out of this wind. All this sand won't be good for the square." "Oh, right." Dak looked around and then realized he had just agreed with one of Rick's suggestions without arguing or mocking it. Sera would be so proud. He turned to her. "Bet you're glad I've got the square in my pants now, huh?" Sera rolled her eyes at him. "Which way should we go?" Rick pointed. "I think I see something that way." The three of them peered down the road, straining to see anything through the wind-blown sand. Dak was trying to decide how best to make fun of Rick in this moment, when a horrible grunting sounded right behind them. The three of them spun around to find themselves face to face with the protruding nose, huge teeth, and flapping lips of a camel. The man riding the camel shook his fist at them, shouting in a language Dak didn't recognize. He wore long robes and a turban coiled around his head. "Arabic," Rick whispered. Dak and Sera cocked their heads at the same time as their translation devices kicked in. The man threw his arms up. "Are you deaf? I said get out of the road!" The camel blared at them again. Spit flew out of its open mouth. Its breath smelled bad, and not in the good way a nice cheese smells bad, in the bad way. Sera plugged her nose while Rick pulled her and Dak off to the side. The rider passed them, and behind him came others. Many others. Most of the camels bore huge bundles slung over their humps. It was a caravan. An actual camel caravan. At the sight of them, facts bubbled up in Dak's mind. That's how it felt, like bubbles in a soda or a burp. They just rose up, and he couldn't keep them in, even though he knew it annoyed most people. "Those bundles are probably filled with spices and silks and frankincense and stuff like that. Baghdad was on the Silk Road trade route, and—" "Dak," Sera and Rick both said. He winced inside, same as always. "Sorry," he shrugged. "At least we know which way the city is. I bet this caravan is going there now." Sera and Rick nodded their agreement with him, so they set off down the road with the caravan, walking through the sandy wind alongside the smelly camels. Neither Sera nor Rick said much along the way. Dak was used to Rick not talking much with him. They'd become better friends than they were in the beginning, after fixing the first few breaks together, but the dude still got on Dak's nerves. A lot. So he didn't mind that he was being so quiet right now. But Sera's silence worried him. Normally, he could practically read her thoughts like she could his, but lately she felt very far away and he had no idea what was going on inside her head. There was something she wasn't telling him. He knew it, but he didn't know what that was, and that really bothered him. The other travelers on the road didn't seem to take any particular notice of them. Dak figured that was because they were still wearing their clothes from China, which was also on the Silk Road, and people here probably saw clothing from China all the time. For once, Dak, Sera, and Rick didn't look so out of place, or out of time. Dak was glad, too, that their Chinese clothes were relatively thick and warm. It was wintertime here, and the desert air was surprisingly cool. Baghdad turned out to be less than a mile away. It soon loomed up out of the dust and sand. The wind died down as they passed through the city outskirts, where some buildings were constructed in stone, but most were made out of mud bricks. They crossed several canals and passed houses with thick walls, low doors, and narrow windows, a design perfect for life in this climate. They crossed open squares where people gathered around wells and in the shade of palm trees. Ahead of them, the outer walls of the city rose up, high and imposing, reminding Dak of a really huge sandcastle. More facts bubbled in Dak's head. Baghdad was built not far from where Babylon used to be, and it was one of the greatest centers of learning in all the world, with giant libraries holding thousands of books. This was a golden age for the Middle East, while Europe was in the Dark Ages. Rick turned to look at him. Dak kept going before he could interrupt. Scholars and philosophers from all over the world traveled here just so they could study, and everyone worked side by side no matter where they came from or what religion they belonged to. The most important thing to them was knowledge. Rick was still staring at him. Dak waited for him to make fun of him, getting ready to fire something back. But Rick didn't say anything. He just stared. "What?" Dak asked. Rick shook his head. "I just don't get why you like history so much." That caught Dak by surprise. How could someone not like history? It was everyone else who was weird, including Rick, and even Sera. But then again, Dak didn't understand why Rick loved languages so much, or why Sera was so into science and math. So why did Dak like history so much? He realized he couldn't exactly answer the question Rick had just raised. They soon arrived at a city gate where many caravans and travelers merged, jostling Dak from all sides. He heard the others around them call it the Khorasan Gate. It was only after joining the crowd that Dak noticed the guards standing watch with their metal helmets and swords. They were collecting a toll from everyone who entered the city. Guys?" Dak stopped in the road. "What are we going to do?" Sera asked. She had obviously seen them too. "We don't have any money." But before they could come up with an answer, the pressing crowd behind them drove them forward. Dak looked around, frantic, but there was no way to escape. The traffic going into the city had caught them in its current, and with each moment brought them closer to the guards. "Just act natural," Rick whispered. "We faked our way out of worse stuff than this." He was right about that. Dak took a deep breath. They shuffled forward behind the large caravan they'd met on the road, and before long they were almost to the guard station. The leader of the caravan, the man who had yelled at them earlier, got off his camel and went to the guards to pay the group's toll. "I have an idea." Rick moved forward. "Follow my lead. Stay close together." Dak and Sera glanced at each other and went with Rick. He led them in between the camels, mixing in with the other members of the caravan. It was a good plan to try to blend in, but Dak found himself forced right up against the backside of a camel, its tail whipping him in the face, and it smelled even worse than the other camel's front had. "We'd better not be here for too long," he hissed. Sera and Rick both suppressed smiles. One of the caravan riders noticed them and looked down, scowling. Rick gave him a sheepish shrug. "Sorry. Busy day at the Khorasan Gate." The rider snorted. After that, the three of them kept their heads down and remained quiet. And when the caravan started moving, they moved with it, staying as hidden as they could. Dak risked a glance at the guards when they reached them, but the men seemed to already be looking beyond the caravan onto the next travelers. "It worked," Dak whispered. "Of course it worked," Rick said, and then Dak regretted saying anything. They passed under the shadow of the gate's high arches, through the city wall, and into a busy street where a cacophony of sights and smells and sounds assaulted them. Buildings rose up several stories to either side, sprouting tents and canopies at their bases. Shopkeepers and street vendors shouted their wares. "The sweetest dates you'll ever taste! Olives, plump, rich olives! Come, run your hands over the finest silk between Samarkand and Damascus. The brightest lapis and jasper your eyes have ever seen." The sharp smell of spices filled Dak's nose, mixed with that of smoke and camel and other things he couldn't place. It was overwhelming and amazing. He felt like Aladdin and could almost believe there was a lamp somewhere waiting for them with a genie in it. "Wow," Sera said. "Okay, let's find a quiet place to pull out the square." "You!" The three of them turned to see one of the guards marching toward them. He pointed at them. "You three! Stop!" "Uh-oh," Dak said. Chapter 2. The Riddle of the Cave. The guard had one hand on the pommel of the sword he wore at his waist. "Did you pay the toll?" "We were with the caravan that just passed through." Rick tried to sound confident. His skill with languages meant he usually ended up being the spokesman. And let's face it, he thought, looking at the other two, that's probably a good thing. "The leader of our caravan paid the toll." The guard looked all three of them over and took his time doing it. "They came from Medina. How is it you are wearing the clothing of China?" "We spent time there before joining up with that caravan," Rick said. The guard didn't seem to be buying it. He kept looking at their clothes. "You're pretty young to be working caravans." For a moment, Rick worried that maybe the man was a time warden, an undercover SQ agent on the lookout for time travelers, and his heart began to pound. But he tried to hide it and told himself to stop being paranoid. "We, travel with our parents." The guard narrowed his eyes. "Yeah," Dak said. "They're silk traders." "And they'll be expecting us," Sera said. The guard released the pommel of his sword. "All right, get moving then." The three of them nodded and turned away. They walked down the street together, and Rick could feel the guard staring at them, his gaze a weight on the back of his neck. "He's watching us, isn't he?" Sera asked. Rick peered over his shoulder. "Yup, just keep moving." "Do you think he was a time warden?" Dak asked. Rick shook his head. "We can't assume that everyone who looks at us funny is a time warden. We tend to get a lot of funny looks." Dak looked down at his Chinese clothing. "I guess maybe we need to find some clothes that will help us blend in better. The good news is that Baghdad at this time was a diverse place. I mean, it was on the Silk Road, after all." "The Silk Road?" Sera echoed. "Duh, like I said before, the Silk Road was a trading route stretching from the Mediterranean all the way to China, meaning Baghdad had people from all over the world coming through here. We don't have to pretend to be locals. We just might want to look a little less exotic." Sera glanced around. "I think we need to check out the square before we do anything about clothes. We need to figure out the break." "Oh, yeah." Dak pointed at an alleyway nearby. "How about over there?" Rick nodded. "Looks good." The three of them crossed the busy street and entered the alley. It was narrow, filled with deep shadows, and aside from a few baskets, it was empty. Dak pulled the square out of his pants, and Rick expected Sera to say something about how gross that was, but she just took the device from Dak with a blank expression. Rick wondered what was going on with her. She wasn't acting like herself. Maybe something was happening with her remnants, those strange feelings and false memories that came in waves and hinted that something wasn't how it was supposed to be. "Okay." She flipped on the square and peered at the screen. Rick waited for her to tell them what she saw there. It was usually some kind of art of memory puzzle, or a coded message protecting what little information the historians had managed to load onto the device. "Listen to this." She read it out loud. "To find what Aristotle gave, speak the words open the cave. Inside a treasure gleaming bright, the jewels of learning, history's light. The square let out a little bleep, and an empty box popped up. Weird. Sera's eyebrows knitted together. It looks like it wants a password for something. For what? Dak asked. Rick peered over Sera's shoulder. Try password. That's what worked before. Wait! Dak held his hand out over the screen. Is this one threatening to blow up if we don't get it right? No, Sera typed. Okay, password didn't work. Any other ideas? Rick had no ideas, but the riddle had mentioned something about history, which meant it was kind of Dak's thing. The kid was annoying, but every once in a while one of those endless, useless facts he pulled out actually helped. See what Dak can do with it. Dak nodded. Let me see it. Sera handed him the square. He read over the riddle again, and within moments, Rick could see him getting all excited. When he got talking about history, he kind of rocked back and forth on his heels. Okay, Aristotle, Dak said. He was the one who founded the historians back in 336 BC. His writings helped uncover the existence of the great breaks in history. That could be what the riddle means about what Aristotle gave, or it could also be referring to how Aristotle's writings influenced the great minds of Europe during the Renaissance. Rick sighed. Sifting through all the facts for the useful one sometimes took a while. That's great, Dak. What else you got? Well, it says, speak the words, open the cave. We are in Baghdad. That line of the riddle might refer to the tale of Ali Baba, which, by the way, some believe was not one of the original tales from the 1001 Nights. Same with Aladdin, which was originally set in China. But it would make sense with the treasure gleaming bright. I'm not sure what that would make the jewels of learning, though. He tapped his chin. I'm going to try something. What? Rick asked. Open sesame. Sera raised an eyebrow. Actually, that sounds right, with the cave and all. Dak nodded and typed it in. The square's screen flashed, and then something else came up. Guys? Dak held the device out. Check this out. Erin Cole appeared on the screen. She was one of Rick's fellow historians, the one who had tried to load all the information they would need about the Great Breaks onto the square. It appeared to be a pre-recorded video created before the attack on the historians' headquarters. She looked stressed, as usual. More stressed than usual, in fact. Hello, she said. Dak and Sera and the rest of our insertion team. The sight of her, thoughts of the old HQ. It all made Rick think about how he'd grown as a historian, about what he'd given up for the mission. Kisa, his first true friend, the girl he'd left behind during their mission in the time of the Maya, the girl who had become the first historian to her people. Rick missed her. When he thought of her, he felt the pain and longing of a different kind of remnant, and he had to take a deep breath to drive it out and focus on the recording. If you are watching this, Erin said, you have reached the Great Break in Baghdad in the year 1258. Rick, Sera, and Dak all looked at one another. That was true. They were in the right place. So far, so good. That's the good news, Erin sighed. Now the bad news. In 2 days, Mongols under the leadership of Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, will sack Baghdad. The city will be decimated. Okay, that was bad news. Rick thought back to Paris when the Vikings had laid siege to it and did not like the thought of going through that kind of thing again. During the destruction of the city, hundreds of thousands of books will be destroyed, including those in the House of Wisdom. What's the House of Wisdom? Rick asked. Dak perked up. Oh, the House of Wisdom. Shh! Sera looked hard at both of them. Do you mind? The House of Wisdom contained a library, Erin said. With many of the writings of our founder, Aristotle, the Mongols emptied the library and threw all the books in the Tigris River. Among the books they destroyed was a volume of Aristotle's research on the Great Breaks, specifically research pertaining to the very first Great Break, or, from your perspective, the last Great Break. The final one you will fix." Rick leaned closer. If the historians didn't have the volume about the last great break... Sera shook her head. "But if the book was lost..." "Shh," Rick said. "Without that book," Aaron said, "that first crucial great break, the prime break, will be impossible to fix, and our entire mission will be lost. New breaks will occur faster than you can fix them. The Earth will be destroyed in the cataclysm. We historians knew this day would come, when our knowledge of the prime break would have to be saved." "Great," Dak said. "No pressure or anything." "Shh," Rick and Sera said at the same time. "Your task," Aaron said, "is to save the library at the House of Wisdom, and with it the writings of Aristotle. It is the only way to save the world." Aaron stepped aside, and then Brent and Mari walked into view on the recording. Rick hadn't seen them since the SQ had attacked them all, before their first break, saving Christopher Columbus from a mutiny. "We want to express our gratitude and admiration," Brent said. "If you've made it this far, you've fixed 8 of the breaks. Only a handful more to go before the prime break." 8 done, only a few left. As Rick thought about that, a dread seeped into him about what would happen to him when they finished. He knew he had messed with his family tree back in 1850. He didn't even know if he technically existed anymore. It didn't help that the people in the video, people he'd known all his life, weren't addressing him by name. But he told himself that was just because he had joined Dak and Sera's mission at the very last second. Mari spoke next. "After you have fixed the Baghdad break and saved the information we need on the prime break, you will face the most dangerous part of your mission so far." "More dangerous than a Mongol invasion?" Rick froze, waiting for what Mari would say next. So it seemed, did Sera and Dak. "Your current square has no information on the prime break," Mari said, "because we didn't have any information to load on it. If you fix the Baghdad break in the past, we will have that information in the present. That means you will have to return to the present for a new square at some point." Rick's whole body felt like he just walked outside into the snow in his pajamas. Every historian knew that once you entered the time stream, it would be extremely dangerous to warp back to the present before all the breaks were fixed. There was no telling what would happen. Paradoxes, holes ripped in the fabric of reality, the end of the universe. But Rick had something else to be afraid of. "We know it's a risk," Mari said. "You have no idea. If Rick went back to the future now, he might cease to exist." "But it's one we have to take," Brent said. "There is no other choice. Hopefully, by this point, history will be repaired enough to cope with the potential paradoxes." Rick swallowed. What if it isn't? "Good luck," Mari said. "And one last thing, Aaron." "There's more?" Dak threw up his hands. "Isn't that enough?" Mari and Brent stepped aside, and Aaron came back on the screen, clutching an armful of papers. "Yes." She adjusted her glasses. "I'm sorry. I've done countless hours of research. Really, you have no idea. I mean, if you could see the mountain of parchment "Aaron?" That was Mari's voice off to the side. "It might help if you could get to the point." "Right." Aaron cleared her throat. "Unfortunately, we have no idea who the historian in Baghdad was. You're on your own." Chapter 3. The Streets of Baghdad. The screen went black. Sera stared at it. Really, the message from Aaron could not have been any worse. Of all of them, Sera was the only one who had seen the cataclysm. She'd witnessed firsthand what would happen to the world if they failed in their mission to repair the breaks. She also knew that somehow she had parents now, in the future. A mother and father who had only been remnants before Sera, Dak, and Rick had begun their mission. Before they'd changed the past. Parents who would die in the flooding, ripped away from Sera just as she'd become aware of them. But if she had to go back to the future for a new square, would they be there? Would she be able to meet them? "So, let's get to it," Dak said. We have a historian to find. I bet he'll be at the House of Wisdom with Aristotle's books, don't you think? How could Dak just move on like that? Didn't he realize what was happening? Sera's irritation got the better of her. How do you know it's a he and not a she, Dak? Huh? Why do you assume that? Dak shrugged, his eyes downward. I don't know. Geez, what's the matter with you? What's the matter with both of you? Nothing, Sera and Rick said at the same time. Sera looked at Rick. He was frowning, his forehead creased in worry. When he looked back at her, Sera saw that Aaron's message had obviously disturbed him, too. Maybe it had something to do with his remnants. She knew he had them, like she did. They talked about them before. Fine, Dak said. Don't tell me. Oh, for the love of mincemeat, Sera said. Quit pouting, all right? Maybe it would be best to just get moving and not think about all that other stuff. Put the cataclysm out of her mind and concentrate on the mission, the break, the really, really important break on which everything depended. Sera sighed. The House of Wisdom seems like a good place to start. Don't you think so, Rick? Yeah. Rick's voice was quiet. Sounds good. Well? Dak looked back and forth between them. Okay, then. Sera took the square and tucked it away. They left the alley, returning to the main street with its seemingly endless stream of pedestrians and camels. She had to admit it was pretty exciting to be here, and not too different from what she'd imagined it would be like. Except for the noise, which was louder than she would have expected. Okay, Rick said. Directions. He stopped someone walking past and asked him about the House of Wisdom. The man gestured and pointed, his hand going one way, then the other. Sera couldn't really hear him, so she hoped Rick got it all. Rick thanked the man, and then said, Let's go. It's on the other side of the city. We'll try to find some clothes on the way. Clothes. Sera looked around, trying to figure out what girls and women wore here, but quickly saw there were a lot more men on the street than women. The men all seemed to be wearing about the same thing, layers of fabric of different patterns and colors, robes with wide sleeves and wide belts, and most of them wore some kind of wrapping or turban around their head. Things would be easy for Dak and Rick, but it looked like it would be harder for Sera. The women wore a wider variety of styles. Some wore plain dresses, or dresses that were brocaded or embroidered, and some wore flowing silks in vivid colors. Some dressed in black with veils that covered their hair and their faces. Still others wore scarves and beaded headdresses. What am I supposed to wear? She asked out loud. Take your pick, Dak said. You should be happy. Lots of cultures and religions mean lots of choices for once. Come on, Rick said. He set off down the busy road. Dak shrugged at Sera, and they followed after him. The road ran a straight course ahead of them, but off to either side, it seemed to Sera, the city stretched away in a maze of narrow, twisting streets. The buildings climbed up high, some with balconies surrounded with wooden screens and canopies that reached out above them. It's so loud! Sera almost felt like she had to shout over the camels, the donkeys, and the shop owners. I know, isn't it great? Dak grinned. They soon came to an enormous archway spanning the road. It almost looked like an older version of the city gate they had just come through, except it was standing by itself in the street, without any walls connected to it. They walked under it and entered an open square in front of a building that was much larger than the rest. It stood apart, decorated with paint and iridescent tiles. Sera turned to Dak. What do you think that is? I don't know, he said. It's a college, Rick said, scowling. Good call. Baghdad has a lot of colleges, Dak said, and a lot of libraries. In fact, there was this one rich guy whose personal library took 400 camels to move. Even I think that's a lot of books for one dude. But we need to find a specific library, Sera said, and a specific book. Rick shook his head. Let's keep moving. Sera grunted. She didn't know what was going on with Rick, and she was trying to be patient, but she was kind of getting annoyed. Not much farther, the road turned sharply to the left, a canal running alongside it, sometimes visible, sometimes underground. Sera couldn't even see the end of the street off in the distance. This city was huge. They walked ahead for what would have been 3 or 4 blocks back home, and before long, all the sights and smells and sounds started to overwhelm her. How were they going to find a single historian in all of this? "I think I see another one of those gates." Dak pointed down the street. Sera squinted. "I think you're right." "They must be pretty old," Dak said. "From when the city was smaller, with a whole different wall around it or something, and now all that's left are these gates." As they got closer to this one, a metallic clanging pierced the air. It sounded like a large group of people was banging a whole bunch of pots and pans together. The 3 of them looked at one another. Then Rick leaned toward a passerby. "Excuse me, but what is that up ahead?" The man looked back over his shoulder. "The archway of the armorers, of course." Armor. If blacksmiths were making armor up there, that explained the sound. It also made Sera wish she had some earplugs, because the noise only got louder the closer they got. This archway was in better condition than the last one had been. Decorations covered much of it, swirling patterns pressed into the clay bricks with more of the iridescent tiles. Up close, they swirled with golds, greens, and browns. The archway still had its gate, too, but it was open, and they walked through it. "Cool," Dak said. "Look at that!" Blacksmiths stood at forges and workbenches near one side of the square, shaping sheets of metal into what looked to Sera like helmets, and bending metal wire into rings, which they linked together into shirts of chain mail. The people around here mostly seemed like soldiers or guards, and as Sera passed by them, she overheard snippets of conversation.
"Hulagu and his Mongol horde are only a few days from the city."
"What about the Caliph's cavalry?"
"Defeated, wiped out."
"All of them?"
"All 20,000. Sera's eyes widened. She knew a little bit about the Mongols. She knew they rode horses, and that the Great Wall of China, where the 3 of them had just been fixing another great break, was built to keep the Mongols out. But to think of them wiping out 20,000 soldiers, and now approaching the city, dropped a chunk of ice in her stomach. "Did you hear that?" she asked Dak and Rick. "We don't have much time." "I've been looking for an opportunity to score some clothes," Rick said. "I haven't seen anything." "I might have an idea," Dak said. "But I need a quiet spot." Quiet? What was Dak thinking of doing? Sera never knew with him, and usually that was exciting and fun. It was part of why they were friends. She liked seeing what crazy ideas he came up with. But that was back home. Here in Baghdad, when the fate of the world was at stake, they didn't need one of Dak's turned out to not be such a good ideas. The crowded road past the archway of the armorers continued as far as the eye could see. They pressed their way down it, the equivalent of another 3 or 4 blocks, until they came to the biggest gate they had seen so far. It was a couple of stories tall, covered in more of the decorations and shimmering tiles. It arched over the opening to a large square, while the road continued on to the left. "We go through the arch," Rick said, "according to that guy's directions." So they passed under its shadow, and the square opened up a wide patch of blue sky above. Sera felt like she could breathe again. She inhaled and smelled new fragrances on the breeze, herbs, flowers, and perfumes. At the far side of the square stood a beautiful mosque. Sera recognized it as a mosque because of the minaret, the tall tower beside it. "That's the mosque of the Caliph," Rick said. "Who's the Caliph?" Sera asked. "He was a religious leader of Islam," Dak said. The mosque had a high wall around it, decorated in bright blue hues that glinted like a lake in the sun. Onion-shaped domes crowned the wall's 4 corners. "He was also the ruler of Baghdad." Dak pointed across the square. "And I bet that's his palace." Beyond the mosque, another city wall surrounded the edge of the square, and beyond that, Sera saw an even larger building. It was decorated with reds, blues, and purples, its many domes and towers forming an imposing skyline over the city. "That wall surrounds a couple of palaces like that one," Rick said. "And a college, and The House of Wisdom. So, how do we get inside? Dak asked. The gate of the willow tree, Rick said. The directions said it's that way. He pointed down a street in the far corner of the square. They set off toward it. Sera was grateful for the open space and the ability to walk without having to dodge oncoming camels. It was a bit warmer out in the sun, and the pleasant smell she'd noticed earlier just got stronger. When they reached the street Rick had pointed at, she realized why. It was a whole market of perfume makers. The fragrances of basil and other herbs hung in the air, the scent of spices and oils and aromas Sera couldn't identify. Sweet smells, sharp smells, and pungent, musky smells. There were more women here, too, outside the perfume shops. We just go through here, Rick said. And then, where's Dak? Sera spun around. He had just been right there beside her, and now he was gone. She scanned the market and spotted him over by a lemon and orange vendor. There he is, she said. What's he doing? Dak climbed up onto a tall basket and held out his hands. Come, he shouted. Listen to me. Oh, no, Sera whispered. This must have been his idea, the one he needed quiet for, and she could already tell it was going to be a bad one. Chapter 4. The Market Inspector. Dak noticed immediately that Sera and Rick were staring at him. Sera, especially, looked worried. Maybe he should have told them what he was about to do before he did it, but they never seemed to like Dak's ideas, even though sometimes his ideas worked out really, really well. Other times... Come! Come! As he shouted from his basket, a curious crowd gathered around him. Dak knew they needed clothes, and to get some, they needed money, because so far he hadn't seen any clothes just lying around waiting for them to come along. He'd been going over what he knew about Baghdad, trying to figure out what they could do to earn some cash, when an idea came to him. He remembered that there were storytellers who performed on the streets. They hadn't seen one yet, but Dak didn't see why he couldn't try to tell a story. If people liked it and they tossed him a few coins, maybe they'd be able to buy some clothes. But now that he was up there with a bunch of people looking at him, waiting, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. Now I will tell you a story. He waved his hand in an arc in front of him. He didn't know why. It just seemed like a storyteller thing to do. Once upon a time... Sera slapped her forehead. Rick folded his arms across his chest. There was a djinn. Dak congratulated himself for using the real word for genie. And this djinn... What? What should his story be about? Dak realized he probably should have figured that out before he got up here, but it was too late to back down now, so he grabbed the first thing that came into his mind. This djinn had a ring that had magical powers. It allowed the djinn to travel backward in time. Sera was shaking her head now. Rick's mouth hung open. What was their problem? One day, Dak said, the djinn met a man in the desert, and the man was wandering around, lost and depressed. And the djinn goes, why are you wandering around lost and depressed? And the man goes, oh, I'm sad because my house burned down and the fire destroyed a book my parents gave to me. It was my prized possession. Dak thought he was doing a pretty good job. The audience seemed to be interested. None of them had walked away yet. So he kept going. When the djinn heard this, he said, I can grant you your heart's desire. What is it? And the man was like, really? My heart's desire is to have my book back. So the djinn used his magical ring and took them both back in time to the man's house before the fire. Hey, this story is actually pretty good. But Dak noticed a man standing at the back of the audience who did not look so happy. He wore a gray robe over a striped one with a bright red turban wrapped around his head. Two fairly big guys, city guards by the look of them, stood on either side of him, and all three of them were glaring at Dak. He kept going. And they snuck into the man's house, and the man from the future wanted to warn the man from the past about the fire, but the djinn was all, no, you said your heart's desire was your book. Dak felt his voice getting louder, and the words came faster. So they went to the man's library, and they found the book his parents had given to him, and they took it, and the djinn used his ring to take them both back to the future where they came from, and the man had saved the book, his one true desire. The end. Dak bowed low. No one clapped. He looked up. A moment later, he heard the light clink of a metal coin hitting the ground in front of him. Then another, and another. The audience broke up, going back to whatever it was they'd stopped doing to listen to him. Dak hopped down from his basket, feeling proud, and collected the money he'd earned. He didn't recognize the coins, and he didn't know how much was there, but he didn't care right then. As he picked up the last, Sera and Rick rushed up to him. "What were you thinking?" Sera was talking in that hissing voice she used when she was mad at him but couldn't yell because there were teachers around. "What do you mean?" He held out his handful of coins. "Look!" "That's great," Rick said. "But what about that thing you just did where you told the whole city about the infinity ring and why we're here?" "I didn't do that," Dak said. Sera lifted an eyebrow at him. "Magical ring that goes backward in time, saving a book from a fire?" Dak looked at the coins in his hand. "I did do that, didn't I?" How could he have not realized he was basically turning their mission into a story? "Oops. What do we do now?" "Hope there wasn't a time warden in the audience," Sera said. Uh-oh. Dak remembered that guy with the red turban and started looking around for him. "Uh-oh what?" Rick asked. Dak spotted him. He and his two guards were stalking toward them, and they looked even less happy than they had before. "Uh-oh him."
You! Storyteller!
The man in the red turban pointed at Dak.
Hold it right there!
"What seems to be the trouble?" Rick asked.
The trouble,
the man said,
is that I don't remember issuing a permit for this young man to tell stories on the street.
He had a long, pointed beard and very deep-set eyes. "You need a permit to tell a story?" Dak asked. "Really?"
I am the market inspector.
The man's glare trampled over all three of them.
And I decide what you need a permit for, and yes, you need a permit to be a public entertainer. Do you have a permit?
Dak gave a little shrug. "Well, no." The market inspector put his hands on his hips.
Then you must forfeit your illicit gain. Turn over the money.
Dak didn't want to. He had earned it. He had found a way to maybe buy some clothes. "Look, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Can't you just let it go this one time?" The man's eyes got sharp and narrow.
I never let things go.
Dak looked at Sera and Rick. They looked back at him. He flicked his eyes in the direction Rick had pointed before. They nodded. "Well, sir, I'm sorry," Dak said. "If I'd known I needed a permit, I would have... Run!" Dak launched into a sprint across the square, Sera and Rick close behind him.
"Seize them!"
the market inspector shouted. Dak looked back and saw the two city guards barreling after them as they left the perfume market and dove into the city. The streets got narrower. They twisted and turned like a maze, climbing up and down steps, and they were as crowded as ever with camels and donkeys. People shouted at the three time travelers as they ran past, bumping into things. Dak accidentally knocked over a cart full of bread. "Sorry!" he shouted over his shoulder. Rick ran up alongside Dak. "Let me lead the way." He turned them down one street, then another. Dak soon lost all sense of direction, and he hoped Rick knew where he was going, but no matter how many turns they made or how far they ran, they just couldn't seem to dodge the market inspector and the guards, who stayed right behind them. "Apparently," Sera shouted, "he really doesn't let anything go." "Keep running," Rick shouted. Eventually, they burst onto a busier, wider street. There were even more people and animals here, more stalls and carts and shops. There was an old guy sitting on the ground nearby selling rugs which he had laid out in stacks in front of his shop. "I have an idea." Sera looked back and then led them to the rugs. She dropped to the ground, grabbed the edge of one of the rugs, and rolled herself up in it. Dak grinned and did the same thing. "You've got to be kidding me," Rick said. But soon he was rolled up in a rug too. The three of them lay there, side by side like burritos, while the rug seller just stared in surprise. Dak wiggled a hand free and flicked him one of the coins he'd just earned, then put his finger in front of his lips to say, "Shh." The old guy caught the coin, looked at it, and then glanced up as the market inspector charged out into the street. The rug seller winked at Dak and looked away. Dak smiled, then ducked back inside his rug and tried to hold completely still. Several moments passed. The sounds of the street carried on around them. Dak realized he was holding his breath, and at the same time realized he couldn't hold it forever. How long would they have to lie there?
"You, rug merchant!"
That was the market inspector's voice.
"We are looking for 2 children, one a Frank and the other a Persian like you, and an older youth with them, an African. Have you seen them?" "Yes, Mutasib, I have seen them," the rug seller said.
Dak went cold inside.
"Well, where are they?"
the market inspector asked.
"They ran that way,"
the rug seller said.
"Toward the gate of the Sultan."
Dak closed his eyes in relief. Then he heard the sound of several feet beating the road away from them, eventually growing distant and quiet until he couldn't hear them anymore.
"You can come out now, little Parashki."
Dak jerked sideways as the old guy lifted the edge of the rug and rolled him out into the street. He got up and dusted himself off as the rug seller did the same with Sera and Rick. "Now that's what I call a magic carpet," he said. Rick turned to the merchant. "Thanks for not telling him where we were," he said.
"Pah."
The rug seller gave Dak back his coin.
"The market inspector is a powerful and unpopular man. It pleases me to find ways to frustrate him."
"Thank you," Dak said. "What's your name?"
"Farid," he said. "And you are?"
"I'm Dak. This is Sera and Rick."
"I am happy to meet you," he said. "And now, I do not want to seem rude, but the market inspector will realize you have slipped out of his grasp and return this way soon."
"Thanks," Rick said. "We'll get going. Could you tell us the way to the House of Wisdom?"
"Oh, the House of Wisdom, is it?"
Farid chuckled.
"Are you scholars, in addition to being rug testers?"
"Yes," Sera said. "I guess we kind of are." Farid gave them directions, and they said goodbye to him. They weren't as far off track as Dak had worried they would be after their escape from the market inspector. Before long, they were standing before the gate of the willow tree, the great palace they had seen before, much closer now. They had circled around it. Rick pointed through the gate. "The House of Wisdom is on the other side." They'd made it. Chapter 5. The House of Wisdom. Rick still couldn't believe how careless Dak had been. What if there had been a time warden in the audience? That could have been the end of the entire mission. As it was, Rick was still worried about the market inspector. He had seemed a little too determined to catch them. Through the gate, they were able to see more of the palace. It was incredible, like something out of those old postcards Rick's grandma Phoebe had kept from all her travels. Now that they were on this side of the wall, Rick could see there were actually several grand palaces and buildings. Gardens grew between them, lush with different trees and palms, and all kinds of colored flowers, bushes, and plants, while fountains spouted and bubbled in their midst. Rick pointed to the right. "The first guy I talked to said the House of Wisdom is one of those buildings overlooking the river." "There's a river running through the city?" Sera asked. "That would be the Tigris River," Dak said. "Along with the Euphrates River, it forms a part of what's known as the Fertile Crescent region." Rick rolled his eyes, but he was too tired to even make fun of Dak's history vomit right now. So Dak kept going. The region was also known as the Cradle of Civilization because it's where some of the first civilizations in the world started, like the ancient Sumerians. Did you know they had the first system of writing in the world? It's called cuneiform. "That's great, Dak," Sera said. "It is, isn't it?" From the sound of it, Dak hadn't picked up on Sera's sarcasm. "We're almost there. Let's just go. We can worry about new clothes later." Rick hadn't said anything to the other two, but he almost didn't want to get to this House of Wisdom place. Every step he took toward it felt like a step toward a future where he didn't exist anymore. The only thing keeping him moving was his dedication to the mission. It was his way of honoring the memory of Kisa. They passed in front of a 2-story building with a series of striped, pointed arches in the walls. Rick remembered that was another college from the first guy's directions. Beyond the college, they could finally see the Tigris River flowing. It was as wide as maybe 4 soccer fields. Sailboats and rowboats moved across its surface like bugs. Bustling wharves and piers covered the shoreline, and across the water, Rick could see the western half of Baghdad. The river flowed right through the city on its way to wherever it went, and it made Rick think about their mission. Fixing the Great Breaks, like removing boulders from the river of time. "It's big," Sera said. "This is called the Wharf of the Needlemakers," Rick said. "And the next building should be the one we're looking for." Up ahead, past a small courtyard, they saw a large plain building. Its walls looked sturdy and well-kept, but lacked the opulent decorations of the palaces and colleges. It had no windows, and a single large door standing open. Several men milled about in front of the entrance, most of them wearing white turbans. To the side of the door, Rick saw a single engraving. It read, "The House of Wisdom." "The House of Wisdom," he said, pleased that he'd taken the time to learn how to read and write Arabic. "This is definitely it." "Okay," Sera said. "So how do we do this?" "What do you mean?" Dak asked. "We just walk in." "Oh, for the love of mincemeat," Sera said. "First you go and blab our mission in front of the whole perfume market, and now you're going to just walk in and, what? Ask which one of them is a historian? Do you realize there could just as easily be SQ Time Wardens in there?" "I hadn't thought of that," Dak said. "I know," Sera said. "But I would have figured it out," Dak said. "But not before it was too late," Sera said. Rick raised his voice to interrupt them. "If we can get in there, the historian may come to us. They're on the lookout for us, remember?" "But so are Time Wardens," Sera said. But that didn't make sense to Rick when he thought about it. "Maybe not. Look, the Time Wardens know Aristotle founded the historians, right? I'm betting if there were a Time Warden in the House of Wisdom, they would have destroyed Aristotle's books a long time ago. There wouldn't be anything in there for us to save from the Mongols in the first place." Dak turned to Sera. "I guess you didn't think of that." "Neither did you. Let's just go in and see what happens," Rick said. They approached the front door, attracting looks from the men standing around outside it. Rick tried to hold his head up in a way that said the 3 of them belonged there, and they knew exactly where they were going. But they hadn't reached the door before one of the men called to them. "Can we help you?" he asked. "We're here to see the House of Wisdom," Rick said, turning back to face him. The man nodded up at the building. "Then your purpose has been fulfilled." Great, this guy was super literal. He was probably a linguist, the annoying kind. "What I meant," Rick said, "is that we have come to visit the scholars within the House of Wisdom." The man left his group and came over to them. "Is that so?" Dak piped up. "It is." "And what is it you seek from us?" the man asked. Dak stuck out his handful of coins. "We've come to make a donation." The man wrinkled his nose at the money like it smelled funky. "A donation?" And now Dak had gone and offended him. The kid was on a roll. "Sure," Dak said. "You guys take donations, right? Don't libraries always need money?" The man's nostrils flared. "The House of Wisdom does not beg for money." Now Sera spoke. "But do you take it when someone offers it?" The man looked back at Dak's hand. "If you wish to contribute to the learning that goes on here, I'm certain such a donation would come back to reward you tenfold." Rick's tension eased. The guy may have been too proud to admit the House of Wisdom needed the money, but he wasn't turning them away. "For our donation," Rick said, "could we maybe go inside?" The man looked each of them up and down.
I suppose that would not hurt anything. Follow me.
Rick sighed in relief, and so did Sera. Dak just grinned. "Open sesame," he whispered. They followed the man to the door, and he ushered them through. Inside, the building had a huge courtyard in the center, lined with columns and arches, and surrounded by 2 stories of doors and corridors. Dozens of people moved around, crossing the courtyard, going in and out of doorways, carrying stacks of paper and scrolls and books.
"And now you have been inside," the man said.
"Could we look around a bit?" Dak asked. The man sucked air through his teeth.
"Let me find Abi."
"Who?" Rick asked.
"Ibn Abi al-Shakur. He volunteers to show newcomers around. He enjoys it for some reason. Wait here."
He walked away, leaving the 3 of them alone.
"This is amazing,"
Dak said.
"There are probably books in here the people of our time have never seen or even heard of. Think of the history."
"I'm more interested in the books on math and science," Sera said. "The only book we're here for is the one that will prevent the cataclysm," Rick said, even though, as he said it, his stomach tightened up.
"Right,"
Dak said.
"But if we happen to see another cool book along the way, there's no harm in looking."
Rick shook his head. "Dak,
Here they are, Abi."
The man who had let them in had returned with another man by his side. The new guy was younger, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s. He wore a pale blue robe and a white turban. A thick beard covered his very round face, and his smile seemed wide enough to touch his ears.
"Welcome,"
he said. The other man nodded and left them, back through the front door. Abi lifted his eyebrows.
"I'm told you wish to make a donation and see the House of Wisdom."
"That's right." Dak held out his handful of coins. The man took them with both hands and a slight bow of his head.
"I do feel some discomfort taking money from a young man like yourself, but I believe you are sincere, and we thank you for your generosity. I am Ibn Abi al-Shakur, but you may call me Abi."
"I'm Dak. This is Sera and Rick."
"Is that so?"
The tone of the man's voice became serious.
"Unusual names."
"Yes, well..." Sera put on that innocent smile that Rick had seen her use before. "We're not from here."
"I perceive that," the man said. "I believe you have traveled far, very far indeed."
Rick thought he seemed suspicious. Was he simply talking about their clothes from China, or did he mean something else? The first guy had said Abi liked to show newcomers around the place, and now Rick wondered why that was. Could it be because Abi was the historian? Maybe being the designated tour guide let him check to see if any strangers coming to the House of Wisdom were from the future. Rick decided to test that theory. "We come from farther away than you would probably think. He said you like to show new people around?"
"I do,"
Abi said.
"I have an interest in where people come from, and how and why they find their way here to the House of Wisdom."
"I bet you hear all kinds of stories," Rick said.
"I do."
Abi smiled.
"But so far, nothing that would seem impossible to believe. No one has yet flown here, for example, or come by other means unknown to the people of my time."
Time. That settled it in Rick's mind. This guy had to be either a historian or a time warden, and since he still doubted they'd find any time wardens here in the House of Wisdom, the moment had come for them to stick their necks out once again. He looked at Sera and Dak and gave a little shrug. He was going for it. "We came here by something you might think is impossible," he said.
"Oh?"
Abi asked.
"Yeah, you could say our boat travels backward up the river."
Abi cocked his head.
"I see. Come, let me show you more of the House of Wisdom."
He gestured for them to follow him, and they proceeded down one of the arched walkways around the courtyard. From there, they took one of the corridors deeper into the building, the scuff of their steps echoing back at them. They passed several spacious rooms, each lined with bookshelves set in arched alcoves with borders of intricate paint and tile around them. Scholars were at work within each of the rooms, reading and writing and speaking in hushed tones. Rick thought back to the courtyard. If all the corridors were like this, with big rooms full of books, then there were thousands and thousands of volumes here. Eventually, they came to what Rick assumed was some kind of sitting area, except there weren't any chairs. Persian rugs covered the floor, and cushions and pillows surrounded a few low tables. It was otherwise empty. "Please, sit down." Abi gestured toward one of the tables. Rick, Sera, and Dak all lowered themselves to the floor. It was actually comfortable. Really comfortable. More comfortable than any of the chairs at the historian headquarters, that was for sure. Rick thought he might suggest to Brint and Mari that they start conducting all historian meetings on cushions on the floor. But then he remembered his fears, and that thought turned to dread. Good. Now we can talk. Abi took a seat across the table from them. As I'm sure you have guessed, I, like you, am a historian. Rick didn't know whether that was cause for celebration or despair.